All right, we're back at conversations with John Byerly, and you know you're getting old, John, when you realize at the break that you pass a bus of teachers that taught you. If Justice Ward, a great appellate advocate and the Illinois Supreme Court Justice, back here at DePaul University and College of Law, and the magnificent job that Brian and Steve and so many other people are doing. Let's pick up where we left off at the break, though, John, and talking and winding up our discussion on cabotage. We have a lot of these restrictions flowing from maritime law and in foreign ownership having to do with subsidies of mail. Isn't that completely archaic, and shouldn't we be looking at a new paradigm on all these restrictions?
I think you're seeing a new paradigm emerge with the globalization of airlines and the entire industry these days. The maritime paradigm is a strange one, but it was one whose concepts were borrowed. What we don't want to see, I think, is the USA airline industry go the way of the maritime industry.
Right, we don't have a U.S. flag shipping fleet that's strong anymore.
And the way we, I think, have to avoid that is not by retrenching and protecting, because you protect yourself into irrelevance. You've got to engage globally, you've got to embrace change, and you have to structure your industry, the American airline industry, its employees, the airports our carriers serve, embrace change and empower them to succeed in a global marketplace. And it's going to be tough. It's a lot of competition out there, but I'm a enthusiastic American and a believer, and I think that we can do that. So that's the direction I think our policy should be headed in, and I hope we can move there. It'll be step by step, but again, not retrenching and protecting more and more, and we see our airlines shrink and become less relevant players internationally.
But did you ever envision that one of the major results of your effort would be these very large alliances? Are we doing what Chairman Oberstar is concerned about, which is carving up the transatlantic marketplace, now carving up the trans-Pacific marketplace, where a collection of carriers does very well, but it makes it very hard for new entrants to come in and compete with the brand loyalty and frequent flyer programs that these carriers all have?
Look, you've got to find a balance here between the economies of scale and scope that an alliance or even a consolidation of a merger of airlines can bring on the one hand, and what I would call competition law, antitrust concerns on the other hand, that would say too few is not enough. We don't want to exclude new competition. My sense is, if you look at the domestic market, we have an incredibly vibrant domestic market in the United States. And when the Justice Department gave the green light to Continental and United, before that to Delta and Northwest, I know that a major factor for their analysis had to be we have an incredible low-cost sector, a different kind of airline that's providing service domestically in the United States that will allow us to have the best of both worlds. The major network carriers moving towards a model that is more sustainable, allows them to return capital.
Are you asked to participate in
No.
those deliberations? Are you asked for your opinion? You know
No,
aviation.
not at all. And I think it's good to keep a separation of roles. We have plenty to do, keep me busy 14 hours a day on preparation of negotiations, coordinating among agencies, but we don't participate in the Justice Department's deliberations on mergers, nor do we participate in the cases that DOT does of antitrust immunity. We keep apprised of where they are because foreign countries are interested, but we don't offer our substantive input.
But now I want you to kind of whisper your views as a private citizen. Were you more concerned about American and British Airways in the One World in terms of the increased concentration across the Atlantic, particularly with two restricted entry markets at places like New York and London?
I was not, because what we saw after the 2007 agreement opened up Heathrow Airport was Heathrow is in fact a place you can break into. You have to have a checkbook to do it, but airlines have checkbooks. They
Or be
bought
an alliance
slots.
member.
Or be an alliance member and work out some sort of economic arrangement where you get slots from an alliance partner. But we've seen Continental buy its way into Heathrow. Initially, I think 4 slots, $50 million a piece for the pairs.
But aren't you worried about the non-alliance member that's trying to get into the world's largest, most lucrative route between London and JFK, as an example? If you're not an alliance carrier, you can't get slots from your partner. Wherefore the opportunity to
So
compete?
Alitalia was selling slots because they're flying less. Other airlines are pulling in and out of Heathrow over time. Gatwick remains as an option. You know, there are plenty of U.S. carriers, take Southwest,
If
that are
Gatwick
flying
remains
to
as an option, why did Continental and Delta leave just as at the first opportunity?
Because they saw in their business model an advantage in flying to the premier hub in London with the highest yield passengers. At the same time, look at the Washington market. You have Southwest with a small operation at Dulles, but a major operation in Baltimore, my hometown airport, at least my current hometown in Baltimore. Great airport. Because they see that they can make a go of it there with their customer base and the service they provide and the lower cost structure there. So I was not, Ken, honestly, I was not worried, and I think we've seen an enhancement of competition across the Atlantic, and I don't think AABA, antitrust immunity, will detract from that. I think it will strengthen the One World Alliance as now one of 3 major alliances competing globally. That's a good thing for consumers.
What did you think about British Airways forming Open Skies Airline? By the way, you should have trademarked that when you negotiated that.
Yeah, I thought about asking for a royalty check, but I was a little late, and the government ethics rules
Yeah,
wouldn't
right.
allow me to do that. Next time.
Sit in the front cabin as a private citizen, at
It
least.
was precisely the sort of innovative response we had hoped would come from the 2007 deal. That is, we would see the European carrier concept, an ability of a British carrier to fly from France, actually become a reality. And I thought it was a plus for consumers. It seems to be an airline that people like to fly. I haven't myself flown on it, but we want to have that opportunity for innovation. There were some other innovative steps that didn't work out, some business class only models. Several airlines thought that would be something that would work. As it was implemented by, I think, 3 or 4 firms, it didn't work well, but the whole point of an open skies arrangement is not to dictate particular results, but to create opportunities for innovation and for experiments. And some experiments are not going to succeed.
Do you believe the airline industry has been innovative? I mean, here is, as I prepared this morning, I Googled you on my iPad, right? And someone tweeted that John Byerly's departure was an awful loss for U.S. aviation. All of this at the click of a finger. Data communications, wireless.
Right.
It's not an advertisement for the product. But are we seeing that kind of innovation in the airline industry, or has it remained unduly static?
Well, I think technological things you can hold in your hand, innovation, it's easier for Apple or for other technical companies to do that. We are seeing it in the aircraft world with, take the 787. Not made out of metal, bigger windows, more comfortable seating, a environment with a little more moisture, so it's going to be a much more pleasant flying experience, and they're going to cut fuel costs massively and emissions with it. In the airline world, you know, when I first came back in '95, the Southwest phenomenon people were talking about, but there were concerns that low-cost carriers might be squeezed out of markets. A big concern when Pat Murphy was acting Assistant Secretary at DOT.
Wonderful public servant.
Incredible public servant, great friend, one of the heroes in the pantheon of U.S. aviation policy. What we've seen is, in fact, Southwest didn't need protection. They have thrived because they've got a great business model. They've made things work. They've also surmounted some of the issues with labor. They have a partnership. Doesn't mean they don't have tough labor management discussions, but somehow that partnership seems to be working better than at some network carriers. So that's a sort of innovation that's great. JetBlue, another case, coming in, different kind of product, different markets, flying out of Kennedy, impacted airport, but they've got a huge share there. Now in the international sphere, being one of the biggest U.S. carriers to some of the Caribbean markets. Incredible surprise, out of the blue, JetBlue. That's innovation in the airline world. I also think the alliances, the structure we've got now, it is a pleasure to fly when you know some single group of carriers is going to see you all the way through, rather than an interline, a succession of tickets where your bags get lost, you don't know whom to turn to. I'm confident we can see that from airlines.
You don't buy the notion that U.S. airlines are lagging in innovation and service standards?
I think most U.S. network carriers would say they are lagging, just as a statistical matter, in the purchase of new aircraft. And that's been the lack of capital to do that, the devastating effects of 9/11, the whole series of events 10 years ago that made it extremely difficult for our airlines to survive, much less make a buck.
What was it like leading international aviation during 9/11?
So, personal story, on 9/11, I had come into the State Department with my big Samsonite carry-on bag, ready to go off to France to negotiate an open skies deal, and then on to Russia to work on our bilateral aviation relationship, overflight issues and so on. We were planning a week and a half of travel. I was headed out on United later in the day. Around 9:15, was it? I had a call from one of my colleagues in the State Department. Janice Bay used to be a negotiator. Said, "John, you need to turn on your little television." I had a little television set in my office. "You need to see what's on." I said, "Well, Janice, I need to talk to you about something else." She said, "No, John, you got to turn on the television." And we saw this horror. So the trip was obviously canceled. All the flights in the United States were canceled. We went back then later in 2001 to France. They invited us to come over. We sealed the open skies deal in one round of talks in Paris. We took the view, Bob Zellick articulated this particularly well, that
Very smart guy.
really smart guy, good leader. You have to continue looking at trade as a way to keep countries together, but the way to surmount economic difficulties is to look to the advantages of globalization. You can't turn inward. So we accelerated, if anything, our open skies efforts after 9/11. Some countries were a little reluctant, but overall we kept up the pace. We didn't.
So did you paradoxically get a warming of relations after 9/11 through sympathy with our plight and the need for more solidarity and counterterrorism?
I don't think any country did a deal with us, an open skies deal, because of 9/11 and sympathy. You look to your national interest and what makes sense for you in aviation. But we did not, and it's to our credit that we as a country did not back off of international engagement in aviation when some might have said maybe we need to reassess. We said, no, this is a policy that makes sense.
I just came from the ICAO General Assembly, and a lot of the world leaders there were privately telling me that they try to avoid the United States like the plague. That if there's an opportunity to connect via Canada or via Mexico to another point, they do, because of the huge hassle factor associated with getting in and through this country. Your reaction?
Saddened by that being the perception. A lot of work has been done to try and improve the travel experience, the visa experience, but after 9/11 we felt compelled, the country felt compelled to change the way we were doing visas, to require personal interviews, to look very carefully at who's admitted to the United States. I think that made sense, it was necessary, it was going to happen. There have been a lot of efforts at the State Department to try and expedite the visa process, but I think there's still work that's got to be done there. I hear the complaints too often from foreign airlines, foreign friends, that it's a hassle.
And staffing's a huge issue. I mean,
Staffing's
unbearable
an issue.
waits at
Could
JFK
we
and other
use
places.
video interviewing, other things? In countries as large as China, the cost of getting the visa can be a major percentage, a significant percentage of the overall cost of the trip. Getting to the interview in where one of the consulates or where our embassy is in Beijing, we need to work on that. We have other developments that on the state side, the processing with Customs and Border Protection, it's going to be more rigorous after 9/11 than it perhaps was before. We're looking for something else. But efforts like getting data on passengers before they get here can streamline the process. So this issue of passenger name record data and access to that enormously important.
What about the non-processing type issues, though? Does it pain you as a diplomat to hear, as I did in Dubai recently, that they don't come here because they were educated here, they love America, they feel discriminated against. They feel as if people are viewing them as terrorists because of their Muslim faith, because of their dress.
Well, to the extent that happens, it's clearly wrong. It saddens me. It's not really America that I know and that I think the country we have, but it's an issue we've got to address with our embassies, with our outreach, and Americans have to have a look at themselves and say, we embrace everyone. We're the country of freedom of religion. But yeah, it's a problem, Ken.
Let's go back to open skies. You negotiated the first stage and the second stage. The first stage had a so-called clawback provision. How close were you in that first open skies agreement to not being able to reach a deal because the British government was objecting that you were giving away Heathrow without adequate compensation?
Well, I think it's clear from the record that British Airways and Virgin Atlantic, the two British carriers flying between the United Kingdom and the United States, opposed the deal that we had negotiated. I think it's very difficult for any government to go against its airlines in approving a deal. I think it speaks to the foresight and integrity of the British government that they decided this nevertheless was the way to go.
Could they have vetoed the deal?
They could have. It was a mixed agreement. What we negotiated was the strange animal under European law of a mixed agreement. So on the U.S. side of the signature page is one block, United States of America. On the European side, the last pages of the agreement are 28 blocks for signatures. The European Community and the 27 individual member states, a signature required under each and every one.
And it was an executive agreement. It wasn't a treaty.
For us, an executive agreement.
No advice and consent by
Correct.
the Senate.
But for them, every single country had to give a thumbs up and sign the agreement.
How worried were you that the whole deal was going to, the Brits would put the kibosh on the deal?
Well, we negotiated a package that we thought could be acceptable. We talked to the British government, the Department for Transport, the Foreign Office, to address their needs, and the insertion late in the process of the clawback clause, the suspension of rights provision.
How did that come about?
It was proposed by the European side. We discussed it, and we decided we could live with it as part of a deal to get to a final first stage agreement with the EU.
And the structure was such that if you didn't make sufficient progress by a date certain, the deal could be unwound, and presumably you could kick out those carriers that had left Gatwick to go to Heathrow to send them packing back to Gatwick. Is that right?
The deal itself, the agreement between us and the European Community and its member states, allowed either government as of late 2010, so late this year, if we not reached a second stage agreement, to give notice of suspension of rights of anything and everything. There was no limit on what you could suspend. You could suspend the whole thing if you'd wish to do so. The Europeans then had an internal European Community arrangement in the European Council, the member states meeting together, that said they would follow they would endorse a decision by one member state or a group of member states to suspend rights in respect of new services to their territory. So in the case of the British, if the British government had said, we want to suspend the rights of U.S. carriers newly admitted to Heathrow, kick out Continental, U.S. Airways, Delta, they would have been, that would have been respected. That was the understanding they had. We could then have responded in that case with suspension of any and all rights we would choose. It would have been a political battle, a tremendous mess.
So did you view that as a relatively meaningless but face-saving bone to throw to the Brits to get their agreement to sign off on the deal? Because you knew that that kind of Armageddon scenario would never happen.
You never know. I thought it was unlikely that it would happen, and therefore it was a good bet to be made that we should pursue this. It was a risk worth taking.
Turned out to be right.
Turned out to be right, but we also turned out to be right in part because we met the deadline. We beat the deadline for getting a second stage agreement second stage agreement eliminates this, this stability-threatening suspension clause. That's no longer with us. That's a real plus for our airlines as well as for consumers.
Did the European side want that to remain in there because you had not satisfied progress because you continued to fight cabotage and foreign ownership restrictions?
There was a bit of discussion about how we would structure after the second stage. I think there was a sense that the suspension of rights clause was either totally unusable and threatening to stability, so it didn't have the support of European carriers in general, maybe one or two. And that a better way of making progress after the second stage was not to have a third round of negotiations with a deadline and then a fourth round of negotiations with a deadline and continue this process in perpetuity, but to normalize the relationship, which is we have a joint committee, we have a formal mechanism for consultations, the joint committee is empowered to look at amendments, and we also have a certain incentivization, a structure where we promise, in essence, to keep talking about ownership and control, and I'd add about noise restrictions in Europe, which are a major concern to our carriers.
We'll talk about the environment in a second because there's
Yep.
another little environmental issue.
Oh, there are a couple out there.
We don't have a third stage,
Correct.
but the European Transport Commissioner recently said we're not done yet.
Right?
What's on the horizon for the third stage or beyond for EU-US?
So there's not a third stage of formal US-EU negotiations. Rather, we have the mechanism of the US-EU Air Transport Agreement Joint Committee, which meets at least once a year. The likely frequency is 2 to 3 times a year. We've got a meeting coming up in mid-November, first one I won't be chairing. That committee looks at the implementation of the existing provisions of the agreement. When there are problems that arise, we try and solve them. It looks at issues of regulatory action, things we're doing, things they're doing that give pause to either side. We have a chance to talk about it, see if we can find solutions.
Trying to get more harmonization or convergence in your regulatory approaches?
We're at least trying to avoid direct regulatory conflict. One area would be in the field of accommodating the interests of disabled passengers. DOT has an approach based on statute that looks to airlines to be the ones who have the duty of accommodation and has detailed regulations that apply now also to foreign carriers. There's continuing rulemaking going on there.
Right.
The European approach is totally different. It looks to airports to accommodate what they call persons with reduced mobility. When you have these different concepts of how to take care of the same interest and validate the same social objectives writ large, you have the potential for real conflict and overlap. So we've had a lot of discussions about that.
Let's talk about the potential for real conflict with the European emissions trading scheme.
Sure.
Legal or illegal?
Well, in the Bush administration, it was labeled by the United States unlawful and unworkable. Our focus of late,
What about the Obama administration?
well, the Obama administration approach has been to focus less on whether it's legal or illegal, but finding a global solution in ICAO. I haven't received a readout of exactly where they are. Today is the last day of the 37th Assembly meeting.
I'm told they have not made adequate progress.
That is my understanding based on talking to colleagues last night after I got back from our session. That's unfortunate because it's a global problem. Emissions, greenhouse gases, it's a global problem, not a local problem. It cries out for a global solution. So the Obama administration is focused not on building up a legal controversy, but seeing where we can find common ground. There'll be a period of evaluation to look at this. Obviously, unilateral measures create problems, legal or illegal. And we need to find an approach where aviation makes a contribution, and a significant contribution, to its greenhouse gas emissions. At the same time, aviation isn't made the scapegoat for concern about greenhouse gas emissions writ large and taxed 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 times over, which is something we're seeing increasingly in Europe with travel taxes, passenger taxes justified on the grounds that they're green, and they're in fact just revenue enhancement measures.
So you'd rather not talk about building legal controversies. You'd rather talk about
That's our focus
making
now.
it workable.
That's correct.
You're putting a lot of jobs for lawyers at stake and doing
Well,
that.
I'm sure the lawyers can build the controversies. You don't, Ken, you do not need my help on
We
this.
do need more controversies, just to
I apologize in
there.
a law school for not heating up the controversy, but I think our focus has been.
If war is the failure of diplomacy, the legal
Or diplomacy is
we're
the
also in it.
continuation of war by other means, right?
Is it true that a major stumbling block with the Europeans over emissions trading is not so much the Europeans, it's the Chinese?
Well, a huge challenge in the assembly was the massive gap between China and some other developing countries, very strongly opposed to really ICAO doing anything that would focus on any responsibility they have for addressing aviation emissions. And on the other end of the spectrum, Europe, which has mandatory legislation in place already with an answer that they think is appropriate, which is the application of their emissions trading scheme to all airlines that fly to or from Europe. Finding common ground between those was very difficult when I was up at the assembly last week, and if the reports are correct, has not proven possible at all.
So what is the divide? If you have some notion the U.S. would support a cap-and-trade system, just not exactly on the timetable or coverage that the European, then we would like to see ICAO take a more leadership effort?
Not necessarily on a cap-and-trade system. That's a means to an end. First, you have to define the end, the goal. And what we sought in ICAO, the United States proposal, was we have an efficiency standard, but in addition, we propose that global greenhouse gas emissions achieve carbon neutrality, carbon neutral growth as of 2020, the U.S. proposal at a level equivalent to that of 2005, which would mean some decrease by 2020. But this is a global goal. It did not, our proposal did not ascribe any particular requirements to any particular country, but would call on countries, at least larger countries, that make a significant contribution to aviation, to submit action plans that would indicate what they could do. In the United States, it may be possible for us to achieve carbon neutral growth before 2020 and at a lower level. We have a mature industry. It may not be possible for China to do that because they're growing, and the U.S. proposal contemplated those sorts of differences, but our goal was to get an agreed global objective for the civil aviation sector.
Do you worry that the airline industry has botched the resistance to emissions trading by saying we're not the problem?
No.
We're only a small percentage of emissions, we reduced it by so
Yep.
much. Go somewhere else. Go to your school buses and your cars.
Maybe 5 years ago, that was an answer. It was 2% of emissions worldwide, and we already are saving money because fuel is our biggest cost. We heard those arguments. What we've seen much in the last 5 years, however, and a lot of it under the leadership of the Air Transport Association of the United States, Giovanni Bisignani and IATA,
Nancy Young doing a great job.
Nancy Young, an incredible job at ATA, what a brilliant person. What we've seen is the industry said, we have a problem, and we have to address it, and we have a plan. So they put on the table in ICAO a proposal to achieve carbon neutral growth in 2020, albeit at 2020 levels. Not quite as ambitious as the U.S. government would want, but it is a pity. It's sad to see that some governments didn't want to endorse even the sort of objective that our industry says it can achieve. The global airline industry says we can get here. It's very strange when some governments say, well, we're not ready to endorse that.
And did some governments turn up the rhetoric unduly in this debate as well?
I haven't been up there this week. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a touch of rhetoric here and there, but I won't point fingers not having heard it. Be hearsay.
Have you focused too much in your job on Europe? Are we too transfixed with Europe when the real growth is in China, is in India, Indonesia, Latin America?
I think there's a lot of focus in my own personal life, professional life, on Europe because I spent 7 years doing the EU negotiations. That said, the U.S. government as a whole, the State Department with DOT, Commerce, we have focused on the entire globe. And I think you can take in the Clinton administration, the Asia initiative, someone like Mark Gerchik was very active on that front, did a great job in pushing liberalization with Asian countries. So we had the willing partners, the New Zealands, the Singapores, the Bruneis, the Chiles, the Pacific Rim. More recently, we made a huge objective of liberalizing with China. So in successive agreements, 1999, we got ultimately UPS, one carrier chosen to be UPS in 2004, 2007, huge liberalization, massive increase in the number of frequencies. And then something I'm personally very proud of and happy to have been part of, negotiating open skies with Japan last December.
Tell us about that. How was that achieved? And some people are calling it Open Skies Light. Is that too derogatory of a name? It's not your typical Open Skies agreement that happens immediately.
It's totally inaccurate as a name, but let me come to that second, how we got there. We've been seeking to liberalize with Japan for years. We had a significant breakthrough in 1998. People like Al Larson and Charlie Honeycutt joined and became a team at the assistant secretary level and drove home a really big win for our industry, but it was still far short of open skies.
It took away the entrenchment of United and Northwest position at Narita.
We still had, well, it allowed some additional access at Narita, but there was still a cast of the haves and the have-nots at Narita. The haves being United, Northwest, and FedEx, the incumbent carriers, and all the rest had a different status and a more restricted status. The Japanese carriers, on the other hand, ANA, JAL, Nippon Cargo Airlines, NCA, were all incumbents. They had three, and that's really, they only had three airlines. That's all they wanted.
Right. That's a difficult negotiating dynamic.
Tough negotiating dynamic.
You wanted more than they wanted.
Yeah, we spent 4 years. I went through 3 negotiating partners on the Japanese side, deputy directors general, getting a mini deal in 2007. And when we got there, we discovered we'd effectively negotiated last year's deal, or the deal we needed 2 years ago. So we'd done something on same country code sharing that Delta and Northwest wanted. Well, within months of our getting the deal, Northwest and Delta had combined. They didn't need same country code sharing. They were one carrier. We managed to get some access that allowed Polar to expand to a second airport in Japan. The market turned on them and they pulled out of Japan altogether. So we said it doesn't make sense to try and do this sort of minuscule, mini-deal incrementalism with Japan. It's time for the big breakthrough. It takes 2 to tango. What turned the Japanese was a decision by ANA that they really wanted to become a more integrated partner in STAR. They wanted antitrust immunity with United. And I take my hat off to the team at United. Mark Schwab was in Japan. Mike Whitaker was then at United in charge of international. Janet Tarver.
Quite the old hand.
Old hand, excellent people. Julie Ettinger, now at FAA, but she was involved in this. And of course, Glenn Tilton leading the overall effort. They figured out that this was something that made sense. The Japanese government came to us essentially February of 2009 and said, we're ready to talk, but we have some problems. Narita Airport.
JAL being one of them as well, right?
JAL being a problem, and it was a very sick carrier at the time, maybe a little less sick now. They're working on it.
What, weighing competing equity investments and reorganization?
Getting money from the government.
Right.
But I think the Japanese government felt it was time, if we could work out the airport issues at Haneda and Narita, we could go to open skies. So we negotiated over a series, 5 or 6 rounds, culminating round in December of 2009. We initialed the text of an agreement then that had all the elements of an open skies agreement. Nothing is missing. It is an open skies agreement, has open skies pricing, unlimited frequencies, unlimited designations, code sharing article in our model, everything we have in an open skies agreement as defined in 1992. What it has in addition that some people have characterized, or I'd say mischaracterized in some cases, are special provisions relating to services at highly slot-impacted airports in Tokyo, Narita and Haneda. What we sought to do, and I think what we succeeded in doing, is ensuring with respect to slots that U.S. carriers have a fair and equal opportunity to compete in a very, very tight environment. So we have the ability to enter Haneda on rules that are fair to both sides. there are a limited number of slots available in these restricted nighttime hours when
Right.
they allow flights from between Japan and long-distance destinations. We got an equal number of flights. We limited the nature of the operations so that Japanese carriers would not have a home court advantage or an excessive one, limiting the hours when there could be takeoffs. We feel that the Haneda services are positive for consumers, and they balance the interests of our carriers in fairness in a new airport.
But there, at least the Japanese reported that antitrust immunity was a conditioned precedent.
They did exactly what the Germans
open
and the
skies.
French and the Canadians did, which was, we're ready to go ahead with this deal if and only if we are satisfied with the result of the antitrust immunity applications that our carriers will file with U.S. partners. And as you know, yesterday, a day before yesterday,
Day before yesterday, right?
the Department of Transportation came out with a tentative decision, not yet final, that grants antitrust immunity. So my hope is that this will turn out and we'll be able to finalize the deal in a matter of weeks.
China,
Yep.
unfinished business?
Yeah, absolutely. We have frequency limitations with China. We've had a number of issues over fair access to Beijing and Shanghai airports for our carriers. We have on the Chinese side, they've raised the issue of visas in the past, which is a difficult one for us. Questions of routings and co-terminalization on the cargo side. We want to achieve progress with the Chinese, but it's going to be a tough slog. We hope to have a round government only or government experts only round in December in Beijing to sort of set the framework for resuming negotiations sometime in 2011.
What do you see as the future of aviation in China and the U.S. carrier presence in China? Very formidable emerging economic power that is starting to throw its weight around in global markets.
They're growing. Someday, I think the expectation is that the Chinese market will be the largest in the world. They have the largest population, incredibly strong economy.
Just took over the UK, I think, in GDP.
They lead the world in greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, they've got a booming economy. It's no surprise. They rank second in the world, I believe, and we were looking at the ICAO work and today's, last year's aviation emissions, right behind the United States. It's going to grow. They're going to buy aircraft. They're going to buy Boeings. They're going to buy Airbuses. They're going to buy other aircraft. They're going to make their own. They're going to have more and more flying as this large middle class grows and wants to travel, just like our own has wanted to travel with deregulation. So we need to be there and present in that market. We need to have a stable relationship that's going to work for the long term. So we
But
need
do you feel
good
like they're going
relations.
to be very protective of their carriers for the near future at least, and not enter into any kind of open skies agreement until they're convinced that they either have a good alliance foundation or can economically and service compete with U.S. carriers and other foreign air carriers?
It's hard to know. In 2004 and 2007, the Chinese opted away from protectionism of their own carriers and towards liberalization, because liberalization of aviation is a good thing, and a good thing for the Chinese
Well,
economy.
they just had burgeoning demand that they had to accommodate.
They had to accommodate the demand, especially on the cargo side.
Right.
We didn't make it all the way to open skies, but we obtained for the U.S. side frequencies, a massive increase in frequencies that we can use and will use. The Chinese carriers obtained an equal number, but they're not about to use that number in the near future. So I think there was a certain degree of visionary leadership, a focus on the broader interests in China at that time. Since then, I think they've refocused as their own airlines are coming back on a little more of the traditional look after our carriers focus. We'll have to see when we get to talks, or my colleagues will have to see when they get to their talks.
A similar case in India?
No, I have open skies with India. Great accomplishment during the tenure of Secretary Mineta. He went over. Karan Bhatia was Assistant Secretary, pushed very hard. Ed Smith was the negotiator for the United States, if I recall. Big breakthrough in a huge market, and we're delighted to have the Indians as open skies partners.
And we're seeing a very dynamic marketplace there.
Yeah.
Right?
The airlines have had some tough days. Bankruptcy, some real pressures. They overbuilt, overexpanded, but it's India's here to stay, and they're building their airports, they're improving. Another market where we'll want to be for the long term.
How about Latin America? Traditionally a high yield, but difficult environment to have Latin American carriers succeed when the likes of one-time Eastern, now American, and others, JetBlue, coming into the Caribbean. It makes it very difficult for places from either the Cayman Islands to Cochabamba to compete with the U.S. carriers, so that the prism of open skies can be difficult for them.
So which carriers are making a lot of money in the world? LAN Chile, Copa, TACA's doing pretty well. They've got good carriers, and they've got a great future now and in the future, great opportunities. I think the closer you are to this big monster country, United States, the more worried you are about open skies and opening up. And we've encountered that to a considerable extent in trying to open markets in Latin America. So we still have a restrictive agreement with Mexico. We've modernized it. We've done some liberalization, but still a far cry from open skies. We'll continue to work on that.
Very difficult situation in Mexico now with the Mexicana going down, Category 2 now.
Right.
How does the United States act as a good, responsible, friendly neighbor and assist?
One of the things, the call by FAA on Mexican safety oversight and the decision to place them in Category 2 was done by the book, done fairly, done openly with the Mexicans, and they acknowledged they didn't have enough inspectors. So they're hiring and training inspectors, and I think the good thing, as a good neighbor, the United States, FAA in the leadership role, is providing training, is providing guidance and assistance. We don't want Mexico to be in Category 2. We don't want Mexican carriers to remain any longer than possible in a status where they can't grow and compete vigorously.
When that happens and the FAA does a downgrade of a country, they burn up the lines at the State Department, do they not? The other country? They normally have a desk officer, you have an assistant secretary for the area, you're there. There is an awful lot of attempts to politically influence that call, is there not?
Yeah, and I've always viewed my office's role in the State Department as one of explaining to our embassies, explaining to our desk officers, and there's a lot of turnover in the Foreign Services, people rotate, that State Department's role is not to interfere in the FAA decision making. That's safety first, and it may be impolitic, it may not fit into the direction we want our bilateral ties to go, to have Category 2 decisions suddenly pop up, but we have to accept that that's the way it should be and is going to be, and we've been very successful. I remember when Al Larson was an undersecretary, we had an ambassador, I won't name the ambassador, but asked about, well, this is just, we got to do something to delay this decision. He said, no, we're not going to do that. It's the wrong thing. We respect FAA's technical competence, safety first. How could you explain to the American people that because we had some election coming up, we allowed an improperly overseen air carrier to fly for a few more months? Didn't happen. And I think we've been pretty consistent in doing that over the years. So right, this is one of the challenges in the job, to explain that it's apples and oranges. You can't really mix the two and say, well, we'll be a little looser on you on the safety side because you're doing something else. And we've had good cooperation on that.
But you've served a role, to your credit, I think, as an independent check sometimes on your own colleagues to say, this is an FAA call, they need to make it from a pure safety perspective. We may have other issues, for example, even with our close ally Israel.
Yep.
Who was downgraded.
Category 2.
But they need to, let the chips fall.
That's right. That's the way we've seen our responsibilities as the principal interface with the FAA and the State Department.
How would you characterize your working relationships with the FAA and the FAA as an institution?
Excellent. We have our roles. We mix it up on some issues. We want to perfect the relationship over. It has to be reinvented from time to time, how we're doing technical assistance agreements, how we're conveying information. But the preparation for this year's ICAO assembly with FAA in the lead.
Is up at ICAO itself, I mean, you had...
It was great.
quite a collection, and a lot of leadership. You had Secretary Napolitano and Secretary LaHood, and
Randy Babbitt was up there.
Randy was there, and the administrator for TSA was up there.
Right, and on the environment issue, Julie Ettinger, the new assistant administrator, in the chair, leading that, but her team was an interagency team. It had FAA experts, people like Carl Burleson. It had people from the State Department, the economic side, and the environment side. It had people from FAA, from EPA in the team, and as well as from the Office of the Secretary.
Interestingly, though, my friend, what it didn't have was an ambassador.
Right, until last Saturday.
Last week. Rather outrageous that the United States of America did not have an ambassador for a period of many, many months in a lead up to a triannual General Assembly. What happened?
Well, I think it took a while for the administration to decide on a candidate who was then under the government ethics rules and requirements for political appointees in a position to accept the job. The processing is arduous, and then you have to get the nomination before the Senate, get the hearing scheduled, the approval scheduled by the committee, and then the full Senate approval. It took much longer than anybody wanted it to take, but sometimes that's just the way our system works. It was unfortunate. It would have been great to have had Dwayne Worth, who's an outstanding safety leader, a pilot, head of the Airline Pilots Association earlier in his career. It would have been great to have had him there, well, months ago.
Right.
But he's there now, so that's a relief.
We'll come back to ICAO in a second, but is the nomination and confirmation process for political appointees in the United States government hopelessly broken?
That's a much bigger issue than my narrow position in charge of aviation. It takes too long to get people in place. There's no doubt about it. And it's stretched out over the years longer and longer. And we see that in the State Department because we have so many ambassadors being appointed and holes being placed, and we need these people. They are the country's representative, not just the president's. They're the United States representative abroad, whether it's to ICAO or to countries abroad, and getting them in place quickly is important. They need to be looked at. The Senate has a constitutional role, but if it takes too long, either to vet them and get the nominations up, or for the Senate to consider the nominations and either thumbs up or thumbs down, that's not serving the national interest.
The United States interests are being harmed by delays in appointing leaders.
If we go without leaders, obviously, I can't see anybody disagreeing with that.
And when you don't have a political assistant secretary or undersecretary, it tends to have a risk-adverse character building into the bureaucracy, or no?
I don't know. I think it all depends on the individual. We've had some fantastic career members of the State Department, Foreign Service and Civil Service, in high-level jobs. I take Al Larson as an example. He was Undersecretary for Economic Affairs in the State Department under Secretary Powell. He did a fantastic job, incredible knowledge, incredible presence abroad, just a fantastic officer. We've had others in similar positions or career people. We've had great political appointees. I don't think it turns on that. What you need is the trust from above. You need the Secretary's trust, the President's endorsement. If you have that, you can succeed. If you don't, you're not going to be successful.
And frankly, some of the people that have been appointed and confirmed by the Senate, you probably would have rather they weren't appointed and confirmed by the Senate.
Some might say that for some, but I'm not going to go there.
ICAO.
Yeah.
It's a UN body. It's got its own bureaucracy. It can move at a glacial pace. Is it an effective institution?
We're really happy with the sort of new energy and direction that Raymond Benjamin of France, the former head of the European Civil Aviation Conference, has brought to ICAO as its new Secretary General. We had long felt that it was time, after the retirement of Assad Kotait, who was a great friend of the United States, a historic figure, as chairman of the ICAO Council, to regularize the way ICAO works, to place the responsibility for mission accomplishment with the Secretary General, not with the chairman of the Council of 36 member states. And Raymond has grabbed the reins. I think he's making the place more efficient. He's focusing on objectives, management by objectives, and I think we're going to see a revitalized ICAO. It's absolutely essential. We need this organization. It needs to function well.
But to date, has it gone too slow for your liking? not been bold enough in its leadership?
Well, there are many roles that ICAO has for safety. It has done a good job on security, and again, after the Christmas attempted bombing on the Northwest flight on Christmas Day last year, to pick up the ball and come out with some strong new measures. The declaration that was issued by the Assembly is an important step. So I'm hopeful we'll see that sort of leadership in other areas. The environment, ICAO is not an institution or a bureaucracy. It's the 190 member states of ICAO. That's really what ICAO is. The member states have to work together in this organization to make it a success. So if we don't succeed, and apparently we haven't succeeded at this stage in ICAO on greenhouse gas emissions, it's not a failing of the Secretariat or of Raymond, it's a failure of the states to come together.
So looking back on quite an illustrious career, and I really mean that, what are some of your best days on the job, best positions you've had? What are some of the worst ones?
Well, I'd say some of the worst were, one of the worst was 9/11. It stands out in my own mind as such a tragedy for the individuals who lost their lives, such a tragedy for aviation, for the country as a whole, for the world as a whole. And I remember on that day, it was after I had my bag with me, because we were, as I said, going to France and Russia. Well, we weren't going there. We had worked at it. We had to get the word out that this trip was canceled. What were we doing? Get word out to the Russians, to the French, talk to people. There were calls coming in. The State Department was evacuated mid-morning. There'd been the bombing at the Pentagon. The White House had evacuated. Washington was emptying. The streets were clogged, but I needed to find a place to work. So we went first to one of the associations on K Street. They'd closed down. I had my bag. I was with Susan Parson, who's now at the FAA, my secretary, Judy Bridges. The three of us were wandering, looking for a place where we could do some stuff we felt we needed to do on that day. So we went to American Airlines over, I think, on 17th Street, their headquarters. One of their planes had been involved, of course, in the tragedy, too. And they were there in a war room trying to figure out what are we going to do. But they were generous. Will Riss was generous and gave us an office we could sit in, telephone that worked. And we went to work for the rest of the day making those calls. I saw Judy and Susan off to home. Subway was working. The train I take to Baltimore was not. They closed Amtrak, closed the MARC trains. So I took the subway out to New Carrollton. My wife drove down with the boys, my two sons, from Baltimore and picked me up. And we drove back. Roads were almost empty. It's the sort of memory, and I'm sure others have the same memory of 9/11. Where were you on that day? You'll always remember it. Sort of like when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, those sorts of days.
Right.
So that was as sad a day, horrible a day as I want to remember in my professional career. Good days, oh golly, when we initialed the text of the US-EU agreement, the late night when we finished the text in December 2009 of our agreement with Japan, 1996 when we did the German U.S. Open Skies Agreement on February 29th, interesting day. Yeah. Some of those were really good times. Another thing that I've always felt really good about, because it's good for individual citizens, was the day that Jeff Shane and I testified before the Senate, before Senator Lugar and his committee, Senate Foreign Relations Committee, urging U.S. Senate advice and consent to the ratification of the Montreal 99 Convention, which replaces a hopelessly antiquated Warsaw Convention. It's good for citizens, allows families whose loved ones have, relatives have died to bring suit in the United States, as they ought to be able to do. Senate approved it soon thereafter. That was a happy day for
not battle
everyone.
over liability endlessly.
Exactly. Crazy legal battles. It didn't make sense. So it was time to modernize a 1929 convention.
That was good for lawyers, but okay.
Okay. Sorry.
Putting us out of business. Is your best job the one you're in?
Yeah, absolutely. I can't imagine a better job in government.
What would you tell a young law student today about how to succeed and what career path to go on?
So I would, and I had a chance a little bit yesterday when I taught in Gabriel Sanchez's class. It's a great group of, I'd say kids, but they're a great group of students. I'm just too old. Look, take the most challenging and interesting courses. Take things that interest you. It doesn't have to be contracts 1, 2, 3, and 4 and trusts and estates. Take something that interests you, like international aviation law. Choose the best professors. Choose the professor who can teach you something well and make you think rather than the course you feel you have to do. If you don't need, you may feel you need corporate taxation, but if the professor's a disaster, don't take that course. Choose a job you like. That can be anything. It may be tax law. I actually liked tax law when I was in law school, took several courses. I think I could have been a happy tax lawyer.
We are very glad you're not a tax lawyer.
Okay. But take something you be passionate about, enjoy it. And that may mean you make a lot of money, or it may mean you make very little money. But if you're happy doing what you're doing, you're going to have a great life, professional life. And take a job where maybe you can make a difference. And I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to do that.
How do you balance professional life and personal life? You travel a lot. How many countries have you visited? Have you ever gone on those little Google map things and pinned your
Maybe
country?
I should do that. I never have.
You should do that. Or go on Facebook. They have that as
Honestly, I don't know that I've been to that many countries. I've been to Japan, Russia, and Belgium unbelievable numbers of times, over and over. It's very difficult. And I think that's one of the challenges lawyers, whether in private practice or in challenging government jobs, academia, all face. I basically do two things in my life. I work at the State Department and I spend time with my family. I don't have major hobbies outside of work. Maybe I should have, but spending time with my kids and my wife is what I try and do when I'm not working.
Would they go with you on trips?
No, it's impossible. My son is with me here in Chicago because he's looking at schools. He's a senior in high school. It's a wonderful opportunity.
It's God's country, so.
Right. And it's God's country here in Chicago.
Favorite city visited?
Oh,
Favorite
wow.
country visited?
I think the most fascinating place I've seen develop over the years in my aviation career is Moscow. So I was there in 1985.
Really?
Not necessarily favorite place, but most fascinating, the change that has taken place.
This had nothing to do with the vodka they gave you in the negotiation, outside, of course, the negotiation.
Gorbachev was there. They were continuing. When I first went in 1985, they had that very brief interlude of anti-vodka, so they gave us some weak Georgian wine.
Right.
No traffic. I remember we left the U.S. Embassy around midnight. I went back home to the hotel and worked some more, but there was not a single car on the street other than our taxi. It snowed, little tracks on the street. Now you get off at Sheremetyevo, and it can take you 2 hours to get into town because of the traffic jams. Fascinating place, incredible place.
John?
Ken, thank you
very much. Please
My
join
pleasure.
me in thanking John Byerly.
Thank you.
Turn it over to Professor Ho.
Thank you, Ken. I want to close this installment of the International Aviation Law Institute's Conversations with Aviation Leaders Oral History Project by once again expressing our heartfelt thanks to John Byerly for giving so generously of his time to be with us here today. Because of our agreed embargo on the release of this streaming video on the web, by the time our viewers see this streaming video, the date of October the 31st, 2010 will have passed, and John will no longer be the U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Transportation Affairs. We wish him every success in the years to come in whatever he chooses to do. He didn't reveal it on tape here today, but I guess we will eventually find out. And we thank him again for his enormous contribution to international aviation, transport, law, and policy in the United States and around the world. I want to thank also Ken Quinn for deploying the full range of his forensic expertise and for really engaging John on so many issues throughout the last 3 hours. And I know that you're very keen to power up that iPad that you mentioned during the session and to see what your associate at Pillsbury have been doing for the last 3 hours. I know that you'll be doing that pretty soon. I think everybody in this room will agree that we've had a masterclass today in international aviation policy, and that we've learned a lot about John Byerly, both personally and professionally, and that we've been furnished with what I would call a rich treasury, what John would call an archive of critical insights, which will inform the work and research of all of those who will be concerned in the future with air transport liberalization. And with that said, let me inform you that we have 2 further interviews in the pipeline, 2 further conversations, one with Fred Smith of FedEx, who was mentioned during your deliberations today, and the other with former Virginia Governor Jerry Beliles, who chaired the 1993 commission to ensure a strong competitive airline industry appointed by President Bill Clinton. And with that, I thank our audience here in Chicago. I thank you for watching this streaming video, and goodbye for now from Chicago.